CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. No new restrictions. Britain's Prime Minister says the country can ride out the current record COVID wave without further curbs.
Our other headlines, France's president says he'll make life difficult for people who have not been vaccinated, but he's criticised for using unpresidential language.
Protesters storm a government office in Kazakhstan as the president struggles to calm unrest over a rise in fuel prices.
The EU's foreign policy chief pledges support for Ukraine amid the Russian troop build-up on the border.
And General Motors is overtaken by Toyota as best-selling United States carmaker, ending a 90-year run at the top.
No new restrictions. That was the message from the British Prime Minister addressing Parliament for the first time this year as coronavirus cases hit record highs.
Boris Johnson's government is also easing some COVID testing rules, despite an increasing level of pressure on hospitals.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkal in London. Naweed, so no new restrictions despite those record COVID cases in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, ending Prime Minister's questions with an update to Parliament. This is the first time he's been in front of lawmakers since the 16th of December when it went on its winter recess. He says that he's met his cabinet earlier today and they're going to stick with the so-called Plan B restrictions they currently have in place in England. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, following Christmas, brought in tougher measures to stop the spread of Omicron there. That's one major thing. He says the current rules here in England will be in place for a further 3 weeks before they're reviewed on the 26th of January. Aside from that, he's also given us a date for when pre-departure tests will be dropped for those returning back to the UK. That'll happen from this Friday, the 7th of January, from about 4 a.m. We'll talk a bit more about testing in a second. But interestingly, one thing that's cropped up quite a lot, aside from Omicron at this Prime Minister's questions, was the cost of living crisis here, as the opposition called it, in the United Kingdom. Inflation at a record high of 10-year record high of more than 5%. It's expected to rise further in the coming weeks. There's also the issue of energy bills, which has hit households all across the UK. So aside from COVID-19, that's been one area, the economy, where the opposition politicians were trying to heap pressure on Boris Johnson. But in terms of what he does moving forward, we've heard that they're going to stick with the Plan B restrictions in place, not as severe and definitely not as far as some in the sector, in the hospital sector, want the Prime Minister to go. The Royal College of Nursing saying that tougher restrictions were needed to stop the pressure on the front line. But one key thing to remember is that this decision not to bring in tougher restrictions will be welcome news for the people sitting behind Boris Johnson in Parliament. A lot of his Conservative colleagues say that if there were any restrictions introduced, that it would mean too much economic damage. So at the moment, it seems England's sticking with its course not to bring in tighter rules.
With COVID-19 cases hitting new record highs, the UK's leader says he wants to ride out the Omicron wave in England. On Wednesday, he's facing lawmakers for the first time in several weeks after the winter break, where his plans to resist any further restrictions will be watched closely, even though the leader of the opposition is now self-isolating with the virus.
The most important thing we can do to look after people during this very difficult time, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that we take the balanced and proportionate approach that we are, to ensure that we're able to keep our country and our society going, Mr. Speaker, and that is exactly what we are doing. And that is why we doubled down on the booster programme, and that is why we are sticking with Plan B, Mr. Speaker. And that's the right approach for the country.
On the COVID front line, it's a very different picture. Hospitals say they're overwhelmed and understaffed, because of Omicron's spread. To try and stop the disruption to the economy, the UK will now test 100,000 key workers every day. And anyone who tests positive using a lateral flow test in England will no longer need to confirm their result with a PCR one if they have no symptoms. The temporary change in rules will allow many to begin and end self-isolation sooner. Officials think about 1 million people are currently self-isolating in the UK. With masks on and regular testing, hundreds of thousands of students are back in classes this week, with schools another sector hit by absences.
Difficult last term. We had a number of illnesses, COVID and non-COVID related illnesses. About a third of the children were off with COVID related issues, so that was difficult, but we managed. We kept school open, we kept all the children in lessons, and we aim to do the same thing again this term.
Further afield, the UK is set to relax rules for international travel. Those returning to the country from abroad will no longer need to take pre-departure tests, a requirement set up around a month ago to keep out Omicron. Trade body Airlines UK said the move had little impact on stopping the variant, and extra testing was costing the sector more than $80 million a week.
Naweed, so some testing rules being relaxed, how big an impact will that have?
Yeah, some key changes here. First of all, as mentioned, travel rules changing. People returning to the UK no longer need to take pre-departure tests for COVID-19 from Friday at 4 a.m. That's going to be a big boost to the travel and tourism sector. Aside from that, within the UK, in England, people who test positive using a lateral flow test no longer have to take a PCR test to confirm it. Now, the idea here is that people will be able to begin their self-isolation sooner and, crucially, end their self-isolation sooner and get back to work. We'd heard in that report about some of the staff shortages, places like hospitals, where there's a lot of pressure right now, according to doctors and nurses on the front line, but also places like schools and public transport. By bringing in this change, only a temporary change, the UK Health Security Agency says it may enable people to get back to work quicker. And it's also what they say the temporary aspect of this will only last as long as cases remain high. When they fall to about below 1% of the population, then these rules will be changed to bring back the requirement for a PCR. Interestingly, according to the government statistics, about 4% of people currently have the virus in England. But if you look at what the Office for National Statistics, the independent body, has said in the last hour or so, it says an estimated 4 million people now have coronavirus in the UK. And in England, that figure rises to about 1 in 15 people, so much higher rates of the virus. Either way, we're seeing record figures, more than 200,000 people testing positive in the latest daily figures. That's the first time the 200,000 figure has been crossed. But just in terms of the economy here, there does seem to be a difference between those in the public sector, for example, hospitals and schools and public transport, who say that these pressures are very, very severe and they're going to get worse and they want more help from the government. And then you have the private sector, which is also worth considering, who'll be breathing a big sigh of relief that more restrictions aren't coming into place. Places like hospitality, places like the travel and tourism sectors. And at the moment, this Plan B restrictions that the government is sticking to in England, it seems like that's a risk the government is willing to take, even if it means a rise in cases in the next few weeks.
Naweed Jabarkal, our correspondent in London, thank you very much.
President Macron of France has vowed to make life difficult for people who are unvaccinated, but he's under fire after using rather unpresidential language. His critics say his use of a vulgar expression is unstatesmanlike as the country heads to presidential elections in April. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. So, Ross, lawmakers are demanding an explanation from Macron for using this kind of language. What's the latest?
Well, Robin, might be unstatesmanlike, might be unpresidential, but if we look back in history, Georges Pompidou and Jacques Chirac, two predecessors in the Élysée Palace, two previous French presidents, have both used this specific verb in question in public pronouncements. So Emmanuel Macron, clearly aware of that. He knows his history, and he's not the first president to use this particular verb. He said in an interview with Le Parisien newspaper that he wants to pee off the unvaccinated. He will continue with that goal. That is the strategy. He really shows some frustration within the government at the 5 million or so people aged 12 and over who are yet to receive one dose of a coronavirus vaccine. There has been some confusion or embarrassment today among English language media of how to translate this verb. No such embarrassment in terms of the government. The government spokesman, Gabriel Attal, speaking after the cabinet meeting, repeated the verb. He did not apologise for it. He did not shy away from using the verb to pee off somebody. And he in fact said, think about it. Maybe a sector of society which is particularly peed off is the healthcare sector, being overwhelmed, being submerged for 2 years now, particularly having to treat people in intensive care who have chosen not to receive a coronavirus vaccine. So some tough talk, and there was some tough responses as well. One of the far-right leaders, Marine Le Pen, saying that this language is unheard of vulgarity, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is one of the far-left leaders, saying that what Macron said was a staggering confession.
And Ross, this round against a backdrop of the presidential election campaign.
Yes, Robin, you'll have your dates set for April 2022 this year. 4 months away now, the vote for who is going to replace Emmanuel Macron, or if the current president is going to run again, because he has not yet declared his candidacy for re-election. But he did touch on the presidential elections in that interview with the Le Parisien newspaper. He said that if you're asking me if I still have ambition, if I still have hopes, if I still have dreams for France in the future, then the answer is yes. He also admitted that he had made his mind up inside. He had not yet decided whether to make that announcement sooner rather than later, but he is all but guaranteed, Robin, to run for re-election, run for the second term in office that he can stand for in this upcoming election. In 2017, during the previous presidential election, the first race he ran, the one he won, he did actually also make some particularly off-the-cuff comments which didn't go down particularly well, so perhaps the comment that he made in this newspaper article might be one of those remarks which comes back to haunt him.
Ross, thanks very much. Ross Cullen there in Paris.
The Chinese city of Yuzhou is on alert after 9 new local COVID cases were reported, along with 23 asymptomatic cases. Officials have been putting control measures in place to try to deal with the outbreak. Share Shuo reports.
Yuzhou in central China's Henan province has been sealed off since Sunday night, following an initial discovery of 2 asymptomatic cases. Vehicles are not been allowed to leave or enter urban areas. Local officials have classified 2 areas as high risk and 6 as medium risk. The city is implementing a closed-loop management system. All residents in controlled areas are required to stay at home. Volunteers are delivering daily necessities for residents in the communities. All facilities are temporarily closed. An initial round of testing covering all local residents was completed on Tuesday, collecting 950,000 samples. A second round in controlled areas is ongoing. The city is looking at all possible scenarios and has prepared 10 centralized isolation hotels and 1,500 quarantine rooms. Officials say they're making all-out efforts to ensure sufficient food and medical supplies for its 1 million people. 夏如雪 CGTN 禹州河南 province.
The German health minister says the government needs to consider further restrictions on social contact to stem the spread of Omicron. The comments come as German Chancellor Olaf Scholz holds his first cabinet meeting of the year. Scholz is due to meet regional leaders on Friday to discuss a possible tightening of measures.
Poland's president has tested positive for coronavirus for a second time. In a tweet, an aide said that President Duda was isolating after several people around him became infected, but he's not thought to be seriously ill.
Hong Kong is banning flights from 8 countries, including the UK and United States, as part of measures to try and stop the spread of Omicron. The 2-week flight ban, which comes into force on Saturday, also applies to Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan and the Philippines. The city's theme parks and gyms have been ordered to shut and restaurants closed in the evenings.
Brussels Airlines flew 3,000 flights without passengers this winter to avoid losing their airport slots. The airline's parent company, Lufthansa, says it's operated 18,000 flights that would otherwise have been cancelled due to lack of passengers. The Belgian government has now written to the European Union urging it to rethink the rules.
The former boss of Swedbank has been charged with fraud over her role in a money laundering scandal in the Baltics. Birgitta Bonnesen is accused of repeatedly spreading misleading information by regulators investigating the so-called Estonian laundromat affair. The crimes relate to the transfer of billions of dollars in illegal cash from Russia and the UK through the offshoot of Scandinavian banks.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Ukraine border tensions are expected to dominate talks in Washington as Germany's new foreign minister makes her first official trip abroad.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Beijing. The world's fastest skaters coming in with speed and balance.
Figure skaters showcasing their elegance and precision are expected to shine.
A sport of focus and concentration. Curling is arguably the game's most strategic event.
The 2022 Winter Games are here. Join us for all the action, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. A quick reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Protesters have forced their way into a government building in Kazakhstan's biggest city as the president struggles to calm unrest over fuel prices. The government has resigned over violent nationwide protests, which began on Sunday. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has imposed a state of emergency in some parts of the country, and he's just announced he's taking over the Security Council. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Julia Chapman in Moscow. Julia, what's the president doing to try to resolve this crisis?
After a turbulent day, President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev took to the television to make a national address to the people, saying that he was blaming the unrest on financially motivated conspirators. He said that he was going to continue a robust response if those protests go on, despite the state of emergency that has been implemented in Almaty, the largest city, and several other parts of the country. He also said that several police officers had been killed in the unrest, and most surprisingly of all, announced this intention to take over the country's Security Council. This is a significant move because this is a position that has been held by his predecessor, Nursultan Nazarbayev, ever since he willingly left the presidency in 2019. And so he is effectively being ousted from that job where many have accused him of still controlling the reins in Kazakhstan for some time now. But this is believed to be an effort by Tokayev to try to quell these protests, try to mollify those who are making demands of the government to crack down on corruption in Kazakhstan and to improve the lives of ordinary Kazakhs.
And what is the latest on those protests? Is there any sign of them calming after 2 days?
Well, it's quite late now in Kazakhstan, so there has been certainly some calming of the situation. It's unclear how much of that is related to President Tokayev's statement or whether we will see more unrest carry on into the night. But there has been violence breaking out sporadically, particularly in Almaty, the biggest city, where protesters stormed several government buildings, set fire to one of them, and were met with a very heavy hand by police who fired tear gas and stun grenades at them as they tried to dispel the protesters. But certainly there are a lot of demands that don't just limit themselves to the price cap on fuel that was the original trigger for these protests. So whether the protesters will consider this to be their demands being met, the ousting of Nazarbayev from his position at the Security Council, it's still early to see what is going to happen in Kazakhstan.
Julia Chapman, thanks for that. Julia Chapman, our correspondent in Moscow.
After being banned in the United States, China Mobile's listing has found a new home in Shanghai. The Chinese telecommunications giant was removed from the New York Stock Exchange last year. Now it's gone public in Shanghai. Gao Ang reports.
A record listing in China's financial hub. The stock opened at 63 yuan, or nearly $10 per share, over 9% higher than offer price. The chairman of the world's largest mobile operator says the listing paves the way for even greater achievements in the future.
This is another milestone in the development of China Mobile. It marks how the company has successfully built a domestic and overseas capital operations platform, laying a solid foundation for promoting digital intelligence transformation and accelerating high-quality development.
According to IPO prospectus, the company aims to raise up to $8.8 billion in its Shanghai listing. Proceeds will be used to fund 5G network expansion, cloud infrastructure, and tech development. China Mobile boasts the most 5G stations worldwide, with 500,000 as of June 2021. This is in line with the country's huge efforts to develop 5G technology. Experts say the listing will also benefit China's capital market.
Having some of the shares listed in mainland market will help Chinese investors to diversify their wealth because now there is a big chunk of their wealth freed up from the housing market.
The China Mobile IPO in Shanghai comes amid a trend of so-called homecoming listings. Amid global uncertainties, including the ongoing China-US tensions, some overseas listed companies are seeking a comeback in either Hong Kong or Shanghai, including tech giants Baidu and Bilibili.
It is part of a bigger trend of homecoming. But at the same time, we cannot anticipate a huge capital flooding in to the stock market since we still don't have complete freedom in the currency exchange and the capital account.
As analysts have said, China Mobile's Shanghai listing will benefit Chinese investors and the capital market. It remains to be seen how this capital market matures as government doubles down efforts to open up the financial sector. Gang, CGTN, Shanghai.
Toyota has replaced General Motors as the top-selling car maker in the United States. It's a position which General Motors has held since 1931. Let's talk to David Bailey, the Professor of Business Economics at the University of Birmingham. David, welcome. This is a totemic moment for the US car industry, isn't it? Is it a blip or is this long-term?
Yeah, we don't know is the honest answer to that. I mean, GM has been at the top spot for over 90 years, but we've seen so much turbulence over the last year, particularly in terms of chip shortages. That's really impacted on GM. whereas Toyota have played it much more cleverly, a very close relationship with its chip suppliers. It never cancelled its orders like some other car makers did. It stockpiled chips, and it's managed to get through this whole chip shortage much better than other car firms. So I'm not sure this is going to be a permanent shift, but clearly Toyota have weathered this storm much more carefully.
And what do you think, just in terms of the products, what is driving Toyota's surging American sales?
It's seen good sales of its medium-sized cars, for example, like its Camry and its RAV4 SUV, down slightly but holding up in the market overall. So it has a good product offering. And what it's managed to do is position itself very well in terms of hybrid vehicles, which appeal in certain markets like California. Of course, Toyota had bet on hybrids in the short term, hydrogen long run, and that's probably got that wrong. So it's now having to play massive catch-up when it comes to rolling out electric vehicles.
If part of this is the crisis around the supply of semiconductors around the world, does that mean that GM, when it gets on top of its supply chain problems, could reclaim the top spot from Toyota, or is this more terminal?
I think it could. I don't think Toyota should have a kind of #1 bumper sticker quite yet. So I do expect GM to reclaim that next year, probably towards the end of the year, once the chip shortage has started to shake out and the industry starts to get back to normal. Of course, we don't really know what normal is anymore in this sort of industry.
Just let's have a word about the more international scene beyond the United States. What about Toyota's successes on a more global scale?
What's interesting, I think, is the whole industry is undergoing profound change. We're seeing this big shift take place towards electric vehicles. It's interesting, for example, that Ford's share price surged this week because it said it would increase production of the F-150 electric vehicle. And in America, the future of electric cars is all about pickups. More broadly, the industry is having to pivot away from the internal combustion engine and towards electric cars. And it's those companies that are best positioned to do that. If we think about not only Tesla, most obviously, but also companies like Volkswagen, which are making a fantastic shift into electric vehicles, but also the Chinese players in a really big way, shaping up as powerful players when it comes to electric cars going forwards.
Ford shares are trading at 20-year high. What's behind that success story? And I wonder, as you mentioned it, how do they compare to Tesla?
I think what's interesting here is that Ford was seen as a laggard when it came to electric vehicles for a very long time. It was really struggling to catch up. It had to do a deal with Volkswagen to share Volkswagen technology in Europe. But we've seen two products do very well for Ford during 2021, which is why the share price is up by 140% last year. The Ford Mach-E SUV doing very well, but also this F-150 Lightning, an electric pickup. It's said that it's already had 200,000 reservations and will be planning to increase output next year from something like 40,000 to 80,000, 150,000. Now, the reason why that's important is the F-150 has for decades been the best-selling vehicle in the United States. And the future of electric cars in the United States is very much about pickups. Think about the Tesla Cybertruck. Think about the Rivian. And if Ford is saying demand for its F-150 is looking good, that means it's going to sell a lot of them and make an awful lot of money.
David, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the programme, Professor David Bailey from the University of Birmingham.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. They're among the world's most disputed ancient artefacts. Now Greece wants their marbles back. But will the UK play ball?
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. No new restrictions. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the country can ride out the current record COVID wave without further curbs.
Protesters storm a government office in Kazakhstan as the president struggles to calm unrest over a rise in fuel prices.
And General Motors is overtaken by Toyota as best-selling United States car maker, ending a 90-year run at the top.
The EU's foreign policy chief has said there can be no security in Europe without the security of Ukraine. Speaking at the start of a three-day trip to the country, Josep Borrell said Ukraine must not be used as a sphere of influence by global powers. His visit comes as President Joe Biden warns the United States will respond decisively if Moscow invades Ukraine as tension grows over Russia's troop build-up on its border. Let's talk to our correspondent Benji Haya in Brussels. So, Benji, what more has Borrell said?
De-escalation through dialogue is the main message coming from that news conference in the past couple of hours. He was sat alongside Ukraine's foreign minister as they attempted to send a strong message towards Russia, warning against possible invasion following that build-up of troops on the Ukrainian border. And it's quite fitting that they met following a visit to the eastern part of the country, where there has been a conflict raging for about 7 years following Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. Josep Borrell saying that there is no security in Europe without the security in Ukraine, and arguing that Europe has a pivotal role to play in the coming days during a series of key negotiations. His key message, I guess, is that that Europe is front and centre when it comes to the discussions between Moscow and Washington. And the quote from him is that any discussion about European security must happen in coordination and in participation with the European Union. Here's a bit more of what he had to say at that news conference.
The will to de-escalate through dialogue, to avoid increasing tensions, to look for solutions, but with a firm stance and with the strong commitment that any military aggression against Ukraine would have massive consequences and severe costs.
So, as you say, a strong message to Russia. How will his words be seen in Moscow?
Well, an equally strong response. Vladimir Putin on this has been pretty resolute, denying that he is the cause of that escalation, saying that he's not seeking aggression in the region and, in fact, pointing the fingers towards the European Union, the United States, NATO as the ones responsible. He says that it's those sorts of powers that need to pull back from the region and that also need to withhold from military support for Ukraine. His representative, his officials have the chance to put forward their case over the course of a series of meetings, not just directly with the United States, but also with other European countries, France, Germany and Ukraine. And also the NATO-Russian Council will be convening next week too. So a series of really essential meetings over the course of the next 7 days or so in order to try to de-escalate that region amid increasing tensions over that border, with threats from Russia of invasion, but threats that, as I said, Vladimir Putin insists that he is not responsible for and ones that he denies.
OK, Benji Hire in Brussels, thank you very much indeed.
Well, perhaps not surprisingly, Ukraine is expected to top the agenda as Germany's foreign minister arrives for talks in Washington on her first overseas trip since taking office. Annalena Baerbock is likely to press for more talks with Moscow when she meets US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. Trent, an important first trip for Baerbock after taking office. What is Germany seeking from Washington?
Yeah, Jamie, I mean, symbolic and significant trip for Minister Baerbock, not just because it's her first trip to America, but of course it comes on the backdrop of those simmering tensions on the Russian-Ukrainian border, and that is expected to really top the agenda, as you say. She released a statement as she's preparing to meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, saying the more difficult times we live in, the more important strong partnerships are, and we as Europeans have no stronger partner than the United States. So clearly trying to set a very warm and friendly agenda with Secretary Blinken before they meet for these discussions. In relation to Russia, she specifically called out Vladimir Putin, saying the joint message that's being sent by Europe and the US is unmistakable. Russia's activities come with a clear price tag. So I think ideally for Berlin, the ambitions out of this trip is to not just really firm up Minister Baerbock's new role as the European Union's biggest economy's foreign minister, but also to really underscore that they are singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to Russia.
They might be, but of course they won't be singing from the same hymn sheet on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. That project remains something of a sticking point between the United States and Germany, doesn't it? How does Washington want to try to resolve this?
Yeah, this has always been the real elephant in the room when you're discussing German-American relations in recent years, because in many ways Washington sees Nord Stream 2, this gas pipeline which will run under the Baltic Sea directly from Russia into Germany, as a real point of leverage for Vladimir Putin, not just over Germany but over Europe. And so they have not been a fan of this project for a long time. In fact, former President Donald Trump slapped a number of sanctions on it, but President Biden has removed those sanctions, and essentially through gritted teeth, the US administration has allowed Berlin to press ahead with it. We understand it is pretty well ready to go. Gas has been filled into it. It's just awaiting final regulatory approval from authorities here in Berlin. I think there's just a real essence of realpolitik at play in all of this, Jamie. I mean, Germany gets about 40% of its imported natural gas from Russia. Plainly, without that gas, it would struggle to keep the lights on over winter and the heating on. So it is, of course, a difficult decision by Washington to allow this project to go ahead. But I think they know that really for Germany, there's no other way for them to keep their electricity grid growing, especially as they look to shut down the nuclear industry in the past few years.
Trent, thanks for that. Trent Murray, our correspondent in Berlin.
Lithuania's president says it was a mistake to allow Taiwan to open a representative office there under its own name.
Gitanas Nausėda said he was not consulted about the move, which has heightened tension with China. China's foreign ministry welcomed his comments.
It is correct to recognize this mistake, but what is most important is to take action in correcting this act of creating one China and one Taiwan, and return to the one China principle. The rights and wrongs of this setback between China-Lithuania relations is very clear. Making excuses for wrong behavior will not help solve or improve bilateral relations. We also warn Taiwan's authorities that any attempt at seeking Taiwan independence is doomed to fail.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has arrived in Kenya, the latest stop on his East African tour. On the agenda, security, climate change and green technology transfer. Kenya's Foreign Ministry says a number of new bilateral agreements will be signed during the visit. Let's talk now to our correspondent Nick Mudimba in Mombasa. So, Nick, tell us about this visit.
Absolutely. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi arrived this evening here in the coastal town of Kenya, Mombasa. And of course, he was received by his counterpart in Kenya, Ambassador Rachel Mamo, who of course led him out.
Unfortunately, we have lost our connection there to Nick Mudimba in Mombasa. The Parthenon marbles on display at a museum in London, but originally from Greece, are one of the world's most disputed artefacts.
Now, with Athens pressing for their return, will Greece finally get their marbles back? Evangelo Sipsas reports.
Standing on the highest hill in Athens, the Parthenon was built 25 centuries ago, dedicated to the goddess Athena. Just 300 meters from the ancient temple, a modern museum built to reunite the existing marbles with the ones taken by Lord Elgin in the early 19th century. Today, reunification is once again gaining momentum.
After 37 years, with recommendations towards the British side and in communication with our side, the whole committee decided unanimously to return the sculptures of the Parthenon to the Acropolis Museum.
A resolution proposed by Greece entitled Return or Restitution of Cultural Property to the Countries of Origin has been unanimously adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. Greece's 3-year resolution was supported by an unprecedented 111 countries, a significant result that could assist Greek efforts in convincing the British government to return the Parthenon sculptures. This resolution is another attempt by Greece to have the marbles returned from the British Museum. Over the decades, there have been countless petitions by citizens, politicians, and celebrities from around the world to return the sculptures. Athens' main argument is that the marbles were chipped off the facade and illegally removed.
If they had been acquired legally, they would have been able to show a receipt, but such proof doesn't exist. Secondly, they bought them, in quotations, not the ones on the ancient temple, which they climbed up and they destroyed, separating aspects of the structure from their original spot and vandalizing.
For many years, Britain argued that Greece did not have the facilities or the technology to take care of the sculptures, an argument blunted after this museum was built. But the British government also argues that they were acquired legally at the time by Lord Elgin in line with the laws that were in place.
It is not as if the Elgin marbles were taken yesterday. We're going back a very long way. And you can go back much further with other artifacts. I would say that every Ming vase belongs to China. You know, I mean, it's obviously a nonsense. And in the context of the times, perfectly legal, and there was nothing wrong with it at all. So don't call us thieves, don't say we're looters, don't talk that nonsense.
Parts of the Parthenon are now under construction, restoring damage caused by weather erosion and war. Greeks hope these restoration efforts will also help convince the UK to return the sculptures to the ancient temple. Evangelo Sipsas for CGTN, Athens.
Greece has been trying to regain the Parthenon marbles for nearly 200 years. So will 2022 finally see the sculptures return to Athens? Paul Cartledge is Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge, and he joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us today, Professor. So your view is that the marbles should go back to Greece. The argument from the British government is that they weren't stolen but acquired lawfully. Do they have a point?
They don't, because there was no, as it were, international treaty between two existing states in the late 18th, early 19th century. So we had an ambassador, and we sent him, this is Lord Elgin, to the Sublime Porte, which is today Constantinople, Istanbul, but there is no formal text of a document which authorized him to do what he in fact did, which was remove the materials that he did. And then he spent quite a bit of not only his own money, but of course state money, because he was given money as ambassador. And he managed to ship them with great difficulty, having originally had great difficulty getting quite a number of them off the actual temple. His original personal motivation was to have the stones for his own estate up in Elgin, up in northeast Scotland. And it was only later, when he realized that he'd need to be recompensed, that he was persuaded to donate them, as he saw it, to the British government, who paid him £35,000. And this is where our government comes in with the notion of legality, because the state, that is the British then state, 1816, paid Elgin £35,000, which is a considerable sum today in millions, in order to partially recompense him. And that, therefore, they claimed was buying something that they then, by buying them from Elgin, owned. Well, if you think about it, the then government of Greece was actually, of course, an imperial external government from Turkey, Ottoman Turkey. Ottoman Turkey doesn't exist today. Would we justify the claim of any state which, by an imperial closure, an imperial foreclosure, deemed that something was theirs simply by act of will and power? I don't think so. So the initial... Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say that when it comes to restitution, you could look at many items in British and other museums and say they should be back in their home countries, like, as we heard in our report, Ming vases to China, for example.
Well, no, that's, I think, a red herring, because let's just be specific about our particular campaign. We claim that it's unique and therefore has no immediate consequences for any other artifact among the 8 million that are in the British Museum. This is a unique case, and we're not even asking for all the Greek things in the British Museum back. It's very, very specific. Parthenon, one temple, one artifact, one cultural object, with immense symbolic meaning both then and today. There is a concurrent campaign, which is part of the, if you like, zeitgeist, in other words, the general feeling that big museums such as the British, such as the Met in New York, do hold things which today would not be justified by any ethical consideration that they should be entitled to hold. So there is one particular group of artifacts, namely the Benin bronzes, which very blatantly were stolen by Britain in 1897. That's got a head of steam going. We're very glad to support them, and they indeed support us. But our case is quite separate, quite unique. The circumstances of the Napoleonic Wars are not the circumstances of the late 19th century, when Britain grabbed the Benin bronzes.
And you talked about the symbolic nature of the marbles, symbolic to both sides. I mean, they're about much more than just statues, aren't they?
Well, the thing that is, there are different sorts of things. The main single type of artifact is a very, very long frieze, 160 meters long, unique in antiquity. If it depicts real human beings, which some people think, that's unique in the whole of ancient Greece. The temple is itself a unique part of an entire development which generated the earliest form of Western-style democracy, very different from ours, but nevertheless, symbolically, there's a terrific connection between freedom and equality that democracy symbolized in ancient Athens, in the same way that in our different circumstances, for example, we don't think slavery is a good thing today. We don't think women should be deprived of the vote today. The ancients are very different from us, but there is a certain symbolic continuity between antiquity and modernity in regard to democracy. And for the Greeks, it means a hell of a lot more than it does for us. And we in Britain, we're not, by the way, alone. There are a number of other countries. Only today, Italy agreed to return a piece to the Parthenon. It actually reached the museum in Athens, I think this very day. There's a feature in the news today. So things are happening in a way that they haven't happened in quite this way for quite some time, mainly because of this anti-colonialist sense that imperialist countries should not profit from their exercise of imperial power.
Professor Paul Cartledge from the University of Cambridge, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you very much for having me on your programme.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, one of the world's biggest shop windows for electronics back in person, but you will need a mask for Vegas.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Let's go back now to Mombasa in Kenya, where we can speak to our correspondent, Nick Mudimba, who is reporting on China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit there. So, Nick, tell us about the visit.
Absolutely. So we're live in Mombasa, coastal town in Kenya, where, of course, Foreign Minister Wang Yi landed today and, of course, was received by his counterpart, Ambassador Rachel Omamo. And there's so much a busy day in store tomorrow, because now this is where bilateral talks will actually be going down in several places across the town. But of course, later on, Foreign Minister Wang Yi will meet President Uhuru Kenyatta, and they'll head straight to the Kipevu oil terminal to inspect the construction that is going there. So the construction, of course, is being done by China. And of course, this will be very instrumental in just making sure Kenya benefits big time from the terminal, the oil situation, the capacity, and of course, the economic impact of just Kenya actually doing business with other countries across the world. So this will just be among all.
Unfortunately, we've lost our connection to Nick Mudimba in Mombasa again.
Let's press on with some of the other stories making the headlines around the world. And the president of South Korea has appealed for more talks with the DPRK after the North fired a suspected ballistic missile off its coast. The launch comes as DPRK leader Kim Jong-un vowed to bolster the country's defences amid stalling diplomatic negotiations. South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has called for sincere efforts to achieve peace between the North and the South.
Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has been discharged from hospital 2 days after being admitted with an intestinal obstruction. Bolsonaro was rushed to hospital suffering abdominal pain while on holiday. It's his latest health complication after being stabbed during a campaign event in 2018.
A judge in the United States says he will decide pretty soon whether to dismiss a civil lawsuit against Britain's Prince Andrew, accusing him of sexual assault. Prince Andrew's lawyers have argued he could be protected from litigation by a 2009 settlement between his accuser, Virginia Giuffre, and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
4 people on trial for pulling down a statue of a 17th century British slave trader and rolling it into a harbour have been found not guilty of causing criminal damage. Lawyers for the defendants told a court in Bristol that the statue of Edward Colston was offensive and a racist hate crime. They added its toppling during a Black Lives Matter march came after 3 decades of campaigning for its removal.
Canada will pay $31 billion in compensation to Indigenous children and families who were removed from their homes. The largest class action settlement in Canadian history has been agreed after a tribunal ruled Canada had discriminated against First Nations people in their child welfare system. Some of the funds will go towards reforming current services.
Australia's Prime Minister says tennis player Novak Djokovic risks being sent home from the Australian Open in Melbourne if he's unable to show why he can't be vaccinated. Djokovic received an exemption from vaccination rules, allowing him to take part in the competition. The news provoked anger in the country, and now he's been held at the border due to problems with his visa.
Now, if you love electronic gadgets, then it's the place to be. After going virtual last year, the world's largest consumer electronics show, CES, is back as an in-person event.
But with the pandemic surging, the event got underway in Las Vegas with caution. Mark New reports.
As attendees picked up their CES badges at the airport, staff handed them COVID-19 rapid tests. When the preview CES Unveiled event kicked off, only vaccinated participants were allowed in, along with mandatory masking, social distancing, and plexiglass dividers. In the weeks leading up to the event, more than 150 companies withdrew from attending in person. That included big-name companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, Lenovo, Google, OnePlus, and Facebook parent company Meta.
Were you worried that this wasn't going to happen?
I'm not going to lie. I mean, certainly I'm human, and what we had to do is we had to balance the fact that we have a few big names that made a big splash for their own reasons that we understand, versus the fact that we are designed as an event and run with a mission.
Shapiro believes attending CES is safer than shopping at many stores and far safer than attending public sporting events.
And what we heard from so many exhibitors is, please go forward with this event. It's so important for us. It's important to get our message out. And that's what's exciting, is that innovation is solving fundamental problems in the world.
That includes companies taking on the very problem that threatens CES itself.
I can take out my mask because in crisis there's also innovation. It's called the LOD, the light of disinfection. The air that I breathe provokes some aerosol, and those aerosols are sucked through this light, which is not a normal light, and inside a tunnel of disinfection with UVC that disinfects the COVID-19 variant Alpha, Delta, and Omicron, but also the other viruses like the flu or the gastroenteritis.
And one of the health tech companies that made the journey to CES is from France, Barracuda. They created the smart mirror called Artemis. It can take my weight, also do my vitals here, and I can look at my skin, right? Have a skin coach, or it can actually help me with a makeover.
If you can see a movie about the mirror, it's really different from testing it for real. But also for pure business relationships, it does not have the same feeling as doing another Zoom call. So it's really changing, and this is a platform, so it's all about working with other startups, working with other technology. So for us to be able to be part of this ecosystem is very important.
Having attended CES Unveil for nearly a decade, this was the first time I saw so many unfilled spaces. Still, more than 2,200 companies are signed up to exhibit at CES this week, determined not to let the pandemic halt the progress of technical innovation. Mark New, CGTN, Las Vegas.
The headlines again. No new restrictions. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the country can ride out the current record COVID wave without further curbs.
Our other headlines: protesters storm a government office in Kazakhstan as the president struggles to calm unrest over a rise in fuel prices.
And the EU's foreign policy chief pledges support for Ukraine amid the Russian troop build-up on the border.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.